I survived a watery grave only to walk straight into another death trap. This time, the ruthless ice queen who saved my life is my partner in revenge. We just infiltrated our enemy's fortress, discovering he built my most lethal, unsolvable labyrinth. Separated by bulletproof glass, if our footsteps are out of sync by a single millisecond, the floor drops into a hydraulic press. I take the first step and... The rain in Geneva was noticeably colder than the rain in Seattle. It lashed against the floor-to-ceiling, bulletproof windows of our safe house, blurring the city lights into streaks of gold and crimson. I stood by the glass, holding a pair of military-grade binoculars in my left hand. I wasn't shivering anymore. 48 hours had passed since we were expelled from the veins of the Alps. 48 hours since we cheated a watery grave and declared war on the architect of our execution. I lowered the binoculars and looked down at my right hand. The heavy white gauze was a stark reminder of the hydrofluoric acid burn, but the paralyzing pain had faded into a manageable, dull ache. "You are overthinking the perimeter grid again." The voice came from the shadows of the expansive, sparsely furnished living room. It was smooth, impossibly steady, and instantly sent a familiar, magnetic shiver down my spine. I turned away from the window. Sloane Sterling walked out of the dim corridor carrying a sleek, black medical kit. She wasn't wearing her ruined corporate suits anymore. She wore a dark, form-fitting tactical turtleneck and black cargo trousers. Her platinum blonde hair was perfectly styled once again, tucking neatly behind her ears. She looked dangerous, immaculate, and utterly breathtaking. "The perimeter grid is practically begging to be hacked," I replied, my voice softening instinctively as she approached. "There's a blind spot in the western camera rotation. It's a 12-second window." Sloane didn't look at the high-tech surveillance monitors scattered across the dining table. She walked directly toward me, stopping only when the toes of her combat boots bumped gently against mine. "Sit, designer," she commanded softly. It wasn't a request about the mission. It was a deeply personal order. I offered no resistance. I sank into the plush leather armchair positioned by the window. Sloane knelt on the hardwood floor right in front of me. She placed the medical kit on her thigh and reached out, gently taking my injured right hand in both of hers. The stark contrast between her lethal profession and the infinite care in her fingertips was intoxicating. 12 seconds is an eternity for someone who knows how to move in the dark," Sloane murmured. She began to methodically unwrap the bandages. Her touch was incredibly light, treating my burned skin as if it were spun glass. I leaned forward slightly, completely captivated by the intense focus in her icy blue eyes. The shark-clean scent of bergamot wrapped around me, instantly erasing the lingering phantom smells of the underground tomb. "I don't like you going into the western courtyard alone," I admitted, my voice dropping to a low whisper. My professional objectivity was completely gone when it came to her safety. "I can bypass the electronic locks remotely from the van." Sloane paused her unwrapping. She lifted her head, her gaze locking onto mine. The air in the room suddenly grew heavy, thick with the unspoken gravity of what we had survived together. She didn't just look at me, she studied me, her eyes tracing the creave of my jaw and the slight worry in my hazel eyes. "You aren't staying in the van, Riley," she said, her voice dropping to a dark, liquid hum. She reached her free hand up, her cool fingers brushing a stray lock of brunette hair behind my ear. Her thumb lingered against the pulse point on my neck. My heart immediately picked up a frantic, heavy rhythm against my ribs. "We walk into that estate together, side by side. I am the security consultant who breaks the walls. You are the architect who breaks their mind." A flush of heat rose in my cheeks. I leaned into her touch, my fierce independence entirely surrendered to the safety of her palm. "They tried to bury us," I whispered, the memory of the freezing water flashing briefly in my mind. "They did," Sloane agreed, her icy eyes darkening with a possessive, predatory wrath. "And for daring to put a scratch on your brilliant hands?" She leaned forward, closing the distance between us. Her lips brushed softly, deliberately against mine. It was a slow, agonizingly tender kiss that tasted of hot coffee and absolute devotion. My breath hitched. My uninjured left hand instinctively tangled into the soft fabric of her turtleneck, pulling her closer. She allowed the proximity, deepening the kiss just enough to make my mind spin, before pulling back with a measured, breathless restraint. "I am going to tear their empire down to the bedrock," she finished, her voice vibrating against my lips. She slowly lowered her hand from my neck and returned her attention to my bandages. She applied a fresh layer of cooling gel and wrapped the clean gauze with precise, firm movements. I sat there, my chest heaving slightly, completely overwhelmed by the chaotic blend of danger and profound romance. She tied off the bandage with a gentle tug. "Better?" she asked, finally standing up to her full, imposing height. "Much," I breathed, flexing my fingers carefully. I forced my brain to reboot, shifting from the intoxicating haze of her touch back to the cold reality of our revenge. I stood up and walked over to the dining table, where the stolen blueprints of the client's Geneva estate were laid out. "The client is a man named Julian Vane," Sloane explained, standing right behind my shoulder. The heat of her chest radiated through my thin cotton shirt. "He is an underground broker for black market tech and stolen corporate data." I stared down at the massive, intricate floor plan of his estate. It was a sprawling, ultra-modern glass and steel fortress built on a private peninsula overlooking Lake Geneva. But as my eyes traced the architectural lines, a cold, creeping sense of dread began to wash over me. "Sloane?" I said, my voice suddenly tightening. I traced a finger over the main foyer, the connected grand hallway, and the two symmetrical descending staircases. "What is it?" she asked, instantly picking up on the shift in my tone. "This isn't just a fortress," I whispered, my blood running cold. The paradox puzzle in the cave wasn't the only thing he stole from my workshop. I pointed to the intricate, shifting, load-bearing walls detailed in the center of the estate. "Look at the grid pattern, the alternating pneumatic locks, the symmetrical division of the east and west wings." I looked back at her over my shoulder, my eyes wide with disbelief. "He built the mirror chessboard?" Sloane frowned slightly, her sharp mind instantly analyzed my words. "The theoretical labyrinth you drafted 3 years ago. The one I scrapped because it was too psychologically damaging to play," I confirmed, my hands gripping the edge of the table. "It requires 2 players to enter simultaneously from opposite ends of the board. Every step one player takes mirrors a physical trap for the other. If our timing is off by a fraction of a second..." I swallowed hard, the magnitude of Julian Vane's twisted obsession finally becoming clear. We don't just trip an alarm, we trigger a synchronized lethal lockdown. Sloane didn't flinch at the revelation. Instead, she stepped closer, wrapping her arms securely around my waist from behind. She rested her chin gently on my shoulder, looking at the blueprint alongside me. "Then it is a good thing," she murmured, her voice a low, confident purr in my ear, "that we are perfectly in sync." The drive to Julian Vane's estate was shrouded in absolute darkness and heavy rain. Sloane was behind the wheel of a stolen matte black Aston Martin. She navigated the treacherous, winding roads, hugging the edge of Lake Geneva with terrifying ease. The dashboard lights cast a soft, ambient glow over her sharp profile. She drove with one hand resting casually at the bottom of the steering wheel. Her other hand rested warmly on my thigh. Her thumb traced slow, deliberate circles against the heavy fabric of my tactical cargo pants. It was a small, entirely unconscious gesture of possession and reassurance. Every time she moved her fingers, a quiet thrill cascaded through my nervous system. I leaned my head against the cold leather of the passenger seat, watching her. I was completely addicted to the effortless way she commanded the space around us. "Heart rate is elevated, designer," Sloane murmured, not taking her eyes off the road. A faint, knowing smile played at the corners of her mouth. "Are you calculating the maze, or are you just distracted?" I placed my uninjured left hand over hers, lacing our fingers together. "A little bit of both," I admitted, my voice soft in the quiet cabin. "The mirror chessboard requires absolute chronological symmetry." I closed my eyes, visualizing the intricate blueprints we had memorized back at the safe house. If I step onto a white pressure tile in the east wing, you have exactly 1.5 seconds to step on the corresponding black tile in the west wing. If we mismatch, or if one of us is too slow, the floor panels drop into a spiked hydraulic press. Sloane's grip on my hand tightened fractionally. "I am never too slow, Riley," she promised, her voice a low, dark velvet. "And you know your own mind better than anyone. We will walk this board perfectly." She smoothly brought the car to a halt beneath the thick canopy of ancient pine trees. We were parked a quarter-mile from the estate's reinforced perimeter gates. The storm outside was furious, the heavy rain masking the sound of the engine. "Showtime," Sloane whispered. She leaned across the center console, bringing her face inches from mine. She didn't kiss me immediately. She let her icy blue eyes search mine, an unspoken vow passing between us in the dim light. Then she pressed her lips to my forehead, a deeply protective, lingering touch. We stepped out of the car and completely disappeared into the stormy night. The rain instantly soaked through our tactical gear, cold and unforgiving. But the adrenaline surging through my veins kept the chill completely at bay. We moved through the dense forest like phantoms, our footsteps completely silent against the muddy earth. We reached the edge of the tree line. A massive, 10-foot-high electrified steel fence stood between us and the manicured courtyard. High-definition security cameras swept the perimeter with calculated precision. "Western camera rotation approaching," I whispered into the secure comms piece hidden in my ear. I crouched behind a thick concrete pillar, my eyes tracking the red lens of the camera. 10 seconds, I counted down softly. Sloane was crouched right beside me, our shoulders pressed firmly together. I could feel the steady, reassuring rhythm of her breathing. 3, 2, 1, blind spot. We moved in absolute, flawless unison. Sloane scaled the reinforced concrete wall beside the fence with terrifying, athletic grace. She didn't use the electrified mesh. She vaulted over the structural support beam. I followed right behind her, ignoring the dull ache in my bandaged right hand. We dropped into the shadows of the courtyard just as the camera completed its rotation. We had successfully infiltrated Julian Vane's fortress. The massive estate loomed before us, a brutalist structure of black glass and heavy steel. It was divided into 2 distinct wings, separated by a towering central atrium. The east entrance and the west entrance, the starting points of the mirror chessboard. "This is where we split," I whispered, the reality of the game finally setting in. I looked toward the heavy steel doors of the east wing, my designated entry point. Sloane was assigned to the west wing. We would be separated by a foot of reinforced concrete and blast-proof glass for the entire maze. Before I could take a step toward my door, Sloane's hand wrapped securely around my wrist. She pulled me back into the deep shadows of the stone archway. She pushed me gently but firmly against the wet stone wall, her body shielding mine from the driving rain. "I despise this design, Riley," she murmured, her voice vibrating with a sudden raw intensity. She crowded into my personal space, completely caging me in. I don't like having walls between us. Her hands moved up to frame my face, her thumbs wiping the cold rain from my cheeks. The extreme contrast between her lethal professionalism and this devastatingly tender vulnerability made my heart ache. "It's only for a few minutes," I promised, looking up into her dark, dilated eyes. I rested my hands on her waist, pulling her impossibly closer. "I will meet you in the center of the board, Sloane. That is the only way this puzzle ends." Sloane let out a ragged, hot breath that washed over my lips. "You better," she demanded, her voice thick with absolute possessiveness. She didn't give me a chance to reply. She crushed her mouth against mine in a fierce, desperate kiss. It was entirely different from the gentle touch in the safe house. This was a kiss meant to brand me, a fiery, demanding collision that tasted of rain and intoxicating heat. I melted into her entirely, my back arching slightly against the cold stone as I returned the kiss with equal ferocity. My fingers tangled in her damp platinum hair, anchoring myself to her completely. In the middle of a hostile fortress, surrounded by lethal traps and armed guards, the only thing that felt real was her. She was my anchor, my protector, and my beautiful, ruthless partner. When she finally pulled away, we were both gasping softly for air. Her forehead rested against mine, our breaths mingling in the cold, damp night. "Stay sharp, designer," she whispered, her thumb brushing my swollen lower lip one last time. "I'll see you in the center," I replied, my voice remarkably steady. We broke apart, the cold air rushing back into the space between us. But the ghost of her touch remained, an invisible shield wrapping around my heart. I walked to the heavy steel door of the east wing. Sloane mirrored my steps, walking to the west wing. I placed my hand on the biometric bypass device we had crafted earlier. I looked across the rain-swept courtyard. Through the downpour, Sloane's icy blue eyes locked onto mine. She gave me a single, sharp nod. "Syncing comms," Sloane's voice crackled smoothly in my ear. "On my mark, Riley." I took a deep breath, focusing entirely on the mathematical grid in my mind. 3, 2, 1, mark. We stepped onto the primary pressure plates simultaneously. A heavy, synchronized mechanical groan echoed from deep within the estate. The heavy steel doors slid open with a pneumatic hiss, revealing the dark, polished obsidian floors of the labyrinth. We stepped into the darkness together, perfectly in sync. The real game had just begun, and we were absolutely going to win. The heavy steel doors slid shut behind me, sealing with a final, echoing metallic thud. The east wing was plunged into an eerie, artificial twilight. The floor beneath my boots was a flawless grid of polished black obsidian and frosted white tempered glass. I stood perfectly still on the designated starting tile. "Sloane?" I breathed, keeping my voice incredibly low. "I am here, Riley." Her voice came through my earpiece, crisp and impossibly close. It felt as though she was standing right over my shoulder. The static-free audio captured the quiet, measured cadence of her breathing. Hearing that steady rhythm instantly centered my racing heart. "The board is live," I announced, my eyes scanning the massive, glowing squares ahead of me. "The pneumatic locks under the tiles are primed. Do you see the sequence?" "I see it," Sloane replied smoothly. "Black tile, 2 steps forward. White tile, 1 step left. Mirror sequence for me." "Exactly," I confirmed, adjusting the strap of my tactical vest. "We step on the downbeat. You dictate the pace." I didn't need to lead this dance. I trusted her sense of timing implicitly. Taking the first step in 3, 2, 1, move, I stepped onto the black obsidian tile directly in front of me. A microscopic fraction of a second later, a soft electronic chime echoed through the corridor. The floor didn't drop. The hidden hydraulic press didn't engage. Perfect sync, I whispered, a rush of triumphant adrenaline hitting my bloodstream. Of course it was, Sloane purred in my ear, her arrogance entirely justified and completely intoxicating. Next step, forward. 3, 2, 1, move. We moved through the first sector of the chessboard with flawless, lethal grace. It was a mesmerizing, terrifying waltz played out across a deadly floor. I could hear the subtle scrape of her boots through the comms, syncing perfectly with my own footsteps. We were separated by a foot of reinforced concrete and blast-proof glass. But mentally, we were moving as a single, perfectly integrated organism. One step left. White tile, Sloane commanded. Wait, I snapped suddenly, my hand shooting up into the empty air. I froze, hovering my boot a millimeter above the frosted glass square. Holding position, Sloane replied instantly, zero hesitation or panic in her tone. Talk to me, architect. I squinted in the dim light, dropping slowly to one knee on my current safe tile. I pulled a tiny canister of compressed atmospheric dust from my tactical belt. I sprayed a fine mist over the white tile I was supposed to step on. The dust didn't settle on the glass. It illuminated 3 razor-thin, bright red beams hovering exactly shin-high across the square. A microfilament laser grid. My stomach plummeted. Vane changed the design, I whispered, a cold sweat breaking out on the back of my neck. He added a reactive thermal laser grid to the primary safe zone. If we step there, the sequence terminates, the rune locks down, and the grid raises to ceiling height. He didn't just copy your homework, Sloane noted, her voice dangerously calm. He tried to make it lethal. He ruined the mathematical elegance, I corrected, a fierce surge of professional insult cutting through my fear. It's a crude, paranoid modification. I stared at the grid, my mind racing through thousands of geometric possibilities. If my side had a laser grid, Sloane's mirrored tile had an equivalent, opposite threat. What is in front of you, Sloane? I asked, my voice tight. A pressure-sensitive void, she answered casually, as if she were describing the weather. The glass tile has been removed. It is a straight drop into a bed of carbon steel spikes. My breath hitched. If she had taken that step, she would have fallen. Don't move, I ordered, my fingers pressing hard against my temples as I calculated the new route. I'm not going anywhere, Riley, she murmured. Her voice dropped an octave, rich with that dark, possessive velvet that completely hijacked my nervous system. Take your time, my beautiful architect. I trust you. The absolute, unwavering faith in her words was a physical weight against my heart. She was standing on a tiny square of glass over a deadly trap, waiting for my mind to save her. And she wasn't afraid. She was completely surrendered to my intellect. The realization flooded me with a profound, intoxicating rush of power and profound devotion. I looked at the board again, the math suddenly crystallizing in my brain. We have to bypass the center row entirely, I said, tracing the diagonal lines with my eyes. It's a lateral jump, 2 meters across the grid, landing on the far black tile. We have to hit the target tile at the exact same millisecond, or the asymmetrical weight distribution triggers the trap. 2 meters from a standing position, in tactical gear, Sloane verified the physics. Are you ready to fly, designer? Only if you catch me, I replied, a small, reckless smile touching my lips.
Always, she promised, the word heavy with a vow that extended far beyond this labyrinth. I stood up, shaking out the tension in my legs. I locked my eyes on the black tile 2 meters to my right. I will count it down, I said, my heart pounding a steady, fearless rhythm. Ready? Sloane confirmed. 3, I bent my knees, loading all my potential energy into my calves. 2. I imagined her on the other side of the wall, mirroring my exact posture. 1. Jump! I launched myself sideways across the deadly gap. I flew over the microfilament lasers, the air rushing past my ears. I hit the black obsidian tile with a heavy, solid thud. I rolled forward, absorbing the impact, and instantly froze. A microscopic fraction of a second passed. Chime. The sweet melodic sound of the electronic bypass echoed through the corridor. Behind me, the red laser grid flared brightly, engaging and sweeping the empty space where I had just been standing. They sliced through the air harmlessly. We had beaten the trap. Flawless execution, Riley, Sloane's voice washed over me, thick with pride and deep affection. I let out a shaky breath, resting my forehead against the cool floor for just a second. You didn't do so bad yourself, consultant, I teased, pushing myself back up to my feet. A heavy, grinding noise suddenly echoed from the far end of the hallway. The massive, reinforced security doors blocking the first sector slowly slid apart. The path to the central atrium was completely clear. We had successfully navigated the outer ring of the mirror chessboard. The door is open, I said, looking down the long, sleek corridor. I know, Sloane replied softly. Keep walking forward, Riley. I will meet you in the center. I adjusted my tactical vest, a fierce, unbreakable confidence settling deep in my chest. Julian Vane thought he could use my own mind against me. But he had severely underestimated the woman walking on the other side of the glass, and the absolute terrifying power of our synchronization. I stepped through the open doorway, ready to burn his empire to the ground. The frosted glass wall that had separated us for the last 10 minutes abruptly ended. I stepped out of the narrow east wing corridor and into the sprawling central atrium of the estate. The architecture here shifted from claustrophobic obsidian to expansive, breathtaking modernism. Above me, a massive domed skylight was being battered by the relentless Geneva storm, the rain drumming a chaotic, heavy rhythm against the glass. But I didn't care about the architecture, the storm, or the aesthetic of the room. My eyes instantly tracked to the opposite side of the circular atrium. Sloane stepped out of the west wing cooling door at the exact same millisecond. For a fraction of a heartbeat, we just stared at each other across the polished marble floor. The physical relief of seeing her, unhurt and entirely in her element, hit me with the force of a tidal wave. Sloane didn't hesitate. She crossed the vast room with long, predatory strides, her tactical boots echoing sharply against the stone. I met her halfway, practically throwing myself into her space. Her arms wrapped around my waist like bands of steel, hauling me completely off the ground for a second as she crushed me against her chest. I absolutely despise putting a wall between us, Sloane rasped, her voice thick with an emotion she rarely let the world see. She set me down, but didn't loosen her grip. Her gloved hands tangled into my damp brunette hair, tilting my head back. She kissed me with a fierce, ravenous urgency that left me completely breathless. It was a collision of adrenaline, relief, and absolute, undeniable possession. I melted against her, my hands gripping the lapels of her tactical vest. I opened my mouth for her, letting her completely dominate my senses. The sharp scent of bergamot and cold rain filled my lungs, grounding me, erasing the residual anxiety of the laser grid. In her arms, I wasn't just safe, I was invincible. When she finally pulled back, her chest was heaving, her icy blue eyes blazing with a beautiful fire. She rested her forehead against mine, her thumbs tracing the high curve of my cheekbones. Perfectly on time, designer, she whispered, a devastatingly soft smile gracing her lips. I told you I'd meet you in the center, I replied, breathless, my heart hammering a frantic rhythm against her chest. Before we could sink deeper into the intoxicating gravity of our reunion, A sharp, artificial hum interrupted the quiet of the atrium. In the dead center of the room, a sleek, cylindrical console smoothly rose from the floorboards. A stark blue holographic light projected upward, forming a flickering, three-dimensional audio waveform. I must admit I am profoundly impressed. The voice echoing from the hidden surround sound speakers was cultured, arrogant, and dripping with false politeness.
Julian Vane. Sloane didn't jump. She didn't even turn around immediately. She simply sighed, her expression shifting instantly from tender devotion to absolute, freezing disdain. She slowly turned her head, keeping one arm securely and possessively wrapped around my waist. Riley Vance, the brilliant architect. Vane's voice continued, echoing off the marble walls. And Sloane Sterling, the ghost who breaks unbreakable vaults. A truly legendary partnership. Cut the theatrics, Julian, Sloane ordered. Her voice wasn't loud, but it cut through the vast room with terrifying authority. Your security is derivative, and your hospitality is lacking. Open the vault. A low, patronizing chuckle filtered through the speakers. The vault is directly behind the console, Miss Sterling, but as your brilliant partner knows, every masterpiece requires a sacrifice. I pulled myself slightly out of Sloane's embrace, my eyes narrowing as I analyzed the console. It featured 2 separate biometric hand scanners, spaced exactly 3 feet apart. Between them rested a digital timer, currently frozen at 60 seconds. It's a classic prisoner's dilemma logic gate, I realized, a cold wave of disgust washing over me. If we both place our hands on the scanners, the floor drops, I deduced aloud, reading the architectural seams in the marble. If only one places their hand, the vault opens for them and the other is trapped. He wants us to betray each other. Bravo, Riley, Vane taunted. Human nature is so wonderfully predictable. Love and loyalty are beautiful concepts, until survival is on the line. The digital timer suddenly beeped, flashing a bright neon red. 59. 58. You have 1 minute to decide who gets to walk away with my stolen data and who stays permanently in my atrium. Vane mocked. I stared at the glowing scanners. It was a cruel, psychologically torturous puzzle designed to break partnerships. But Julian Vane had made one fatal miscalculation. He didn't know us. I looked up at Sloane. She wasn't looking at the timer. She wasn't looking at the scanners. She was looking entirely at me, a dark, amused smirk playing on her lips. He thinks trust is a variable that can be manipulated, Sloane murmured, her voice dripping with sheer contempt for the man listening. He thinks we are playing by his rules, I agreed, a thrilling, reckless excitement igniting in my veins. I walked up to the console. The scanners require a closed biometric loop, I whispered to Sloane, my mind analyzing the fatal flaw in the electronics. They measure the electrical resistance of the human body. If the system detects 2 separate, distinct electrical signatures, it triggers the trap. But if the system detects a single, continuous electrical circuit crossing both scanners, Sloane finished my thought, her icy eyes lighting up with brilliant, dangerous understanding. It overloads the logic gate, I confirmed. It defaults to an open state. 30 seconds. How much voltage does it need to read us as one single entity? Sloane asked, stepping right beside me. We have to be perfectly grounded, and we need maximum physical contact to transfer the current seamlessly between our bodies. Sloane let out that low, captivating hum. She took off her tactical gloves, tossing them carelessly onto the marble floor. I can certainly provide maximum physical contact, designer. 15 seconds. Sloane reached out and grabbed my left hand, intertwining our fingers so tightly there wasn't a millimeter of space between our skin. Put your right hand on the left scanner, she instructed softly. I placed my bandaged right hand firmly onto the glowing blue glass. Sloane placed her free right hand onto the right scanner. 10 seconds. The machine hummed, attempting to read the biometric data. It's not enough, I whispered, feeling the faint static charge building in the console. The resistance is still too high. The circuit isn't fully closed. Look at me, Riley. I turned my head. Sloane's face was inches from mine. She didn't hesitate. She didn't care that Julian Vane was watching through the cameras. She closed the final gap, capturing my lips in a deep, wet, completely uncompromising kiss. The moment our mouths met, the biological circuit snapped entirely shut. The moisture of our breath, the absolute flush contact of our bodies, created a flawless bridge for the microcurrent. A violent shudder of electricity traveled through my arm, across my chest, and directly into hers. I gasped into her mouth, my fingers curling tightly against the glass scanner. Sloane kissed me harder, her thumb pressing firmly against the pulse point on my wrist, grounding us completely. 3, 2, 1. The console let out a high-pitched, agonizing electronic screech. The blue holographic light violently flashed red, then instantly short-circuited into absolute blackness. Sparks showered from the base of the pedestal. We had completely overloaded the logic gate. A heavy, pneumatic hiss echoed through the atrium, far louder than the storm outside. Sloane broke the kiss slowly, her lips swollen, her eyes incredibly dark and victorious. She didn't let go of my hand. We turned toward the back of the atrium. The massive, impenetrable steel doors of Julian Vane's inner vault were slowly sliding wide open. "Checkmate," Sloane whispered into the silence of the room. She pulled me close, kissing the side of my temple as we walked directly into the heart of the enemy's fortress. The air inside the inner vault was surgically cold. It wasn't designed for human comfort. It was climate-controlled to preserve the towering rows of massive, blinking servers that housed Julian Vane's illegal data empire. The heavy pneumatic doors sealed shut silently behind us, locking us inside the belly of the beast. At the far end of the glowing blue aisle, bathed in the harsh light of his primary monitors, stood Julian Vane. He didn't look like the omnipotent puppet master he had projected through the holographic console. He was a slightly balding man, in an exceptionally expensive, albeit rumpled, Italian silk suit. His face was entirely devoid of color. He was staring at us as if we were ghosts who had just walked through a solid brick wall. That logic gate was hardwired to absolute biological parameters, Vane stammered, his voice stripped of all its previous cultured arrogance. He took a stumbling step back, bumping into his own desk. It is physically impossible to bypass a closed resistance loop without triggering the deadfall. Sloane didn't draw a weapon. She didn't need to. She walked down the center aisle with the slow, deliberate grace of a lioness cornering a wounded gazelle. I walked perfectly in step beside her, the lingering heat of our kiss still buzzing wildly through my veins. "You understand hardware, Julian," Sloane said, her voice dropping to a terrifyingly quiet, icy register that sent a shiver of pure intimidation through the freezing room. "But you fundamentally misunderstand power." She stopped 3 feet away from his desk. She didn't raise a hand, yet her sheer presence pinned him against the monitors like a physical weight. "You tried to reduce human connection to a predictable variable," I added, stepping out from behind her protective shoulder. I looked at his terrified face with absolute, unadulterated contempt. "You thought my designs were just traps to break people.
You forgot that I also build the keys to escape them. I didn't wait for his response. I bypassed him completely, stepping right up to the primary server terminal. This was my domain now. I pulled a sleek, encrypted titanium drive from the pocket of my tactical vest. I ignored the throbbing in my bandaged right hand and plugged the drive into the master port with my left. "What are you doing?" Vane demanded, a sharp spike of panic finally overriding his shock. He lunged forward, raising his hand to grab my wrist. He never made it halfway. Sloane moved faster than the human eye could track. Her hand shot out, wrapping around his throat with brutal, unyielding precision. She didn't squeeze enough to crush his windpipe, but she applied enough localized pressure to instantly freeze him in his tracks. "If you so much as breathe in her direction again, Julian," Sloane whispered, her icy blue eyes boring directly into his terrified soul, "I will demonstrate exactly how a structural collapse works on the human cervical spine. Do we have an understanding?" Vane let out a pathetic, choked gasp, nodding frantically. Sloane shoved him backward with effortless strength. He collapsed into his expensive leather chair, completely paralyzed by fear. With the physical threat neutralized, Sloane turned her back on him entirely, the ultimate display of disrespect. She stepped up right behind me, wrapping her arms securely around my waist. The contrast was daggering. The hands that had just threatened to snap a man's neck now rested gently on my hips, pulling my back flush against the soft, warm curve of her chest. "How is the architecture looking, designer?" Sloane murmured, pressing a soft, lingering kiss to the sensitive skin just beneath my ear. "It's beautifully flawed," I replied, a dark, victorious smile spreading across my lips. I focused on the glowing terminal screen. My left hand flew across the keyboard, bypassing his expensive firewalls with embarrassing ease. I located the root directory containing my stolen blueprints, the paradox lock, the mirror chessboard, all the nightmares he had stolen from my mind. "I'm executing a deep-level zero write on all architectural files," I narrated softly. I could feel Sloane's steady heartbeat thumping against my spine, grounding me, making me feel utterly invincible. And while I'm in the kernel, I paused, opening the payload on my encrypted drive. "I am introducing a cascading logic virus into his black market ledgers, client identities, and offshore routing. Men." Julian Vane let out a strangled, horrified noise from his chair. "No! No, wait. That is billions of euros. That is a decade of leverage." "That," Sloane corrected smoothly, burying her face into the curve of my neck and breathing in my scent, "is the price of touching what is mine." I hit the final execute key. The massive wall of monitors flashed from cool blue to a glaring, catastrophic red. Warning klaxons began to wail silently on the screens as the progress bars violently spiked. Deleting 20%, 50%, 80%. "It's burning," I whispered, watching his entire criminal empire turn to digital ash in real time. "Let it burn," Sloane replied softly. She turned me around in her arms, completely ignoring the flashing red lights and the sobbing, ruined man behind us. She framed my face with her hands, her icy eyes melting into something so profoundly warm and devoted that it stole the breath directly from my lungs. "You are absolutely brilliant," she murmured, her thumb brushing over my cheekbone. I had a good security consultant watching my back. I smiled, wrapping my arms around her neck. "You have me for the rest of your life, Riley," she vowed, the absolute certainty in her voice leaving zero room for doubt. "No more cages, no more traps, only us. 100% master drive completely wiped." The monitors flatlined, plunging the room back into the dim, ambient glow of the server racks. Julian Vane was ruined. The nightmare was officially over. Sloane leaned down and captured my lips once more. It wasn't a kiss of desperate survival, nor a frantic collision of adrenaline. It was slow, victorious, and overwhelmingly tender. It was a promise of quiet mornings, shared coffee, and a future where the only puzzles I designed were for the sheer joy of creating them. I kissed her back, pouring all my love and absolute trust into the embrace. We broke apart a minute later, the silence in the vault feeling entirely peaceful. "Shall we go home, designer?" Sloane asked, her arm wrapping securely around my waist. "Take me home, Sloane," I replied. We turned and walked out of the freezing vault, leaving the ruins of the empire behind us. We didn't look back. The storm outside was finally beginning to clear, and for the first time in a very long time, I couldn't wait to see the sunrise. We walked out of the glass fortress exactly the way we had entered, together and completely unstoppable. There were no alarms blaring in our wake. There were no armed guards rushing the courtyard. Julian Vane's entire digital infrastructure was dead, which meant his automated security grid was nothing more than expensive, useless metal. We pushed through the heavy front doors and stepped out into the crisp Swiss morning. The violent storm had finally broken. The heavy, oppressive clouds were fracturing, giving way to brilliant, piercing streaks of golden sunlight. The surface of Lake Geneva mirrored the dawn, transforming from a pitch-black abyss into a breathtaking expanse of shimmering sapphire. I took a deep breath, filling my lungs with the clean, rain-washed air. It tasted like freedom. Sloane's arm was still wrapped tightly around my waist, keeping me anchored to her side as we walked back through the quiet pine forest. When we finally reached the stolen Aston Martin, the sheer exhaustion of the last 48 hours suddenly crashed into me. The adrenaline that had kept my blood pumping like liquid fire finally evaporated, leaving behind a heavy, profound ache in my muscles. I leaned against the passenger door, my knees trembling slightly. Sloane noticed immediately. The dangerous, predatory edge she had carried inside the vault vanished in a heartbeat. "I've got you," she murmured, her voice incredibly soft. She opened the door and gently guided me into the leather seat. She didn't just close the door, she leaned in, buckling my seatbelt for me with a tender domestic care that made my heart swell. She brushed a damp lock of hair from my forehead, her fingertips lingering against my skin, making sure I was real, safe, and entirely hers. The drive back to the safe house was wrapped in a comfortable, golden silence. The car's heater blew warm air over us, slowly chasing away the damp chill of the night. Sloane drove with her left hand, while her right hand held my left, our fingers perfectly intertwined on the center console. Every few minutes, she would lift my hand and press a soft, lingering kiss to my knuckles, her icy blue eyes warming every time she looked at me. By the time we walked through the door of our safe house, the sun was fully above the horizon, flooding the apartment with warm, buttery light. I dropped my heavy tactical jacket onto the floor. I didn't care about the mess. I turned around and Sloane was already there. "Let me take care of you, Riley," she whispered. It wasn't a question. It was a deeply romantic vow. She stepped into my space, her hands moving expertly to unfasten the heavy clasps of my tactical vest. Her movements were agonizingly slow and deliberate, treating my battered body with absolute reverence. She slipped the vest off my shoulders, letting it fall to the floor alongside my jacket. I looked up into her eyes. The terrifying ice queen who broke unbreakable vaults was completely gone. The woman standing in front of me was entirely exposed, her walls completely dismantled by the love she held for me. "You must be exhausted too," I whispered, reaching up with my good hand to trace the sharp line of her jaw. "I have never felt more alive in my entire life," Sloane replied, her voice a low, vibrating hum that sent a cascade of warmth straight to my core. She led me down the hallway and into the expansive, marble-lined master bathroom. She turned on the rainfall shower, letting the steam quickly fill the room and fog the massive mirrors. The sound of the rushing water was incredibly soothing, a stark, beautiful contrast to the terrifying underground flood we had survived. Sloane turned back to me. With heartbreaking gentleness, she helped me peel away my damp, ruined cotton t-shirt. The cool morning air kissed my bare skin for only a second before Sloane stepped closer, radiating absolute heat. She unbuttoned her own tactical turtleneck, discarding it with a fluid, careless grace. She was breathtaking. The soft morning light caught the athletic curves of her shoulders and the smooth, pale expanse of her collarbone. She wrapped my bandaged right hand in a specialized waterproof sleeve from the medical kit, ensuring it stayed perfectly dry. Then she took my good hand and led me into the warm downpour of the shower. The hot water felt like pure heaven against my aching muscles. I let out a long, shaky breath, leaning my forehead against Sloane's bare shoulder. She wrapped her arms around me, pulling my wet body completely flush against hers. "You're safe, my beautiful architect," she murmured, pressing a kiss into my wet hair. "No one will ever put you in the dark again." She picked up a bars of rich, bergamot-scented soap. With agonizingly slow, sensual movements, she began to wash the dirt, the cement dust, and the memory of the labyrinth from my skin. Her hands glided over my shoulders, down the curve of my spine, and across my waist. Every touch was an unspoken declaration of ownership and profound adoration. I closed my eyes, completely surrendering to the intoxicating sensation of her hands on my body. The steam thickened around us, creating our own private, impenetrable world. When she finished washing my back, I turned in her arms. I reached up, my wet fingers tangling into her sleek, platinum hair, ruining its perfect style and making her look wonderfully, beautifully undone. I pulled her face down to mine. Our lips met beneath the warm cascade of the water. It was a kiss that possessed zero urgency, but infinite depth. It was slow, wet, and deeply exploring. I tasted the clean, fresh water on her lips, feeling the slick, hot friction of our bare chests pressed tightly together. A soft moan escaped the back of my throat as her hands slid down to firmly grip my hips, pulling me impossibly closer. The tension between us was no longer born of survival or fear. It was pure, unadulterated desire. She backed me slowly against the warm marble wall of the shower. Her kisses trailed down from my lips, tracing the sensitive line of my jaw and resting at the frantic pulse point on my neck. She lingered there, her lips soft and worshipful, drawing a ragged, trembling breath from my lungs. "I am entirely yours, Riley," Sloane whispered against my wet skin, her voice thick with emotion. "Mind, body, and soul, completely yours." "And you are mine," I gasped, holding onto her broad shoulders as if she were the only solid thing left in the universe. We stayed under the warm water until our skin was completely flushed, communicating everything we needed to say through the desperate, loving language of touch. When we finally stepped out of the shower, Sloane wrapped me in a massive, thick towel, drying me off with that same agonizing, devoted care. She carried me, literally picked me up in her strong arms, and brought me into the sun-drenched bedroom. She laid me gently onto the center of the plush, white mattress, following me down into the soft sheets. The nightmare was dead. The real world was waiting for us. But right now, tangled in the warm blankets and drowning in the brilliant, loving blue of her eyes, this was the only paradise I ever needed.
The Geneva sun was fully awake now, pouring a river of warm, golden light across the plush white duvet of our bed. I didn't open my eyes immediately. I didn't need to. For the first time in my entire adult life, my mind wasn't racing with blueprints, escape routes, or complex architectural algorithms. There was no ticking clock. There was no impending threat. There was only the steady, incredibly soothing rhythm of Sloane's breathing
and the heavy, protective weight of her arm draped securely across my waist. I shifted slightly against the high thread count sheets, sinking deeper into the warmth of the mattress. Instantly, Sloane's arm tightened around me, pulling my back flush against her bare chest. She was already awake. I could feel the gentle, rhythmic rise and fall of her lungs, and the incredibly soft press of her lips against my bare shoulder. "Good morning, my beautiful architect," she murmured, her morning voice a raspy, dark velvet that sent a cascade of pure electric heat straight to my core. I smiled, keeping my eyes closed, as I tilted my head back against her shoulder. "Good morning," I whispered, my voice thick with sleep and absolute contentment. She pressed another kiss to the sensitive curve of my neck, letting her lips linger against my pulse point. Her left hand slowly trailed down my side, tracing the curve of my hip with agonizingly slow, reverent devotion. Every slide of her fingertips across my skin felt like a silent, unbreakable vow. I finally rolled over, turning in the circle of her arms to face her. The morning light caught the sharp, breathtaking angles of her face. Her sleek, platinum hair was charmingly messy, falling over her forehead in a way the world never got to see. But it was her icy blue eyes that completely captivated me. The cold, calculating distance of the impenetrable security consultant was entirely gone. They were soft, dilated, and looking at me with a depth of love so profound it actually made my breath catch in my throat. I brought my good left hand up, resting my palm against her warm cheek. Sloane closed her eyes and leaned heavily into my touch, letting out a soft, contented sigh. "I could stay right here for the rest of my life," she confessed, opening her eyes to look directly into mine. "I wouldn't object to that," I replied, a soft smile touching my lips as my thumb stroked her cheekbone. Sloane shifted her weight, rolling slightly so that she was hovering over me. She supported herself on her forearms, caging me gently against the mattress. The heat radiating from her body was entirely intoxicating. She looked down at me, her expression turning surprisingly vulnerable. "I have spent my entire existence looking for the fatal flaw in everything," Sloane said quietly, her gaze dropping to my lips before rising back to my hazel eyes. "I looked at buildings, security systems, and people, and I only saw how they could be broken, how they would eventually fail." She brought her hand up, her long fingers gently tracing the line of my jaw. "I built my life on the absolute certainty that nothing was impenetrable, that everyone had a breaking point." Her voice dropped to a heavy, emotional whisper. "And then I walked into your escape room in Seattle. I saw your mind. I saw how fiercely you protected your heart by building those magnificent, impossible cages." She leaned down, pressing a soft, heartbreakingly tender kiss to the corner of my mouth. "You didn't break, Riley. You just opened the door for me. You are the only flawless thing I have ever found in this world." A hot tear pricked the corner of my eye. I wrapped my arms around her neck, pulling her down so her forehead rested against mine. "You aren't a threat that needs to be kept out, Sloane," I whispered fiercely, my heart swelling with an overwhelming, consuming love. "You never were. You are the only person who ever truly saw me." Sloane let out a ragged breath, completely surrendering her fierce exterior. She captured my lips in a deep, sweeping kiss. It was slow, lazy, and utterly devoted. There was no rush, no desperate need to prove anything. We had all the time in the world. I parted my lips for her, melting completely into the mattress as her tongue tangled with mine, exploring the sweet, familiar warmth of my mouth. Her hand slid up into my messy brunette hair, holding me exactly where she wanted me. The physical intimacy was so intense, so undeniably romantic, that the rest of the universe simply ceased to exist. When we finally broke the kiss to breathe, we were both smiling, our faces flushed with heat and happiness. "So," Sloane murmured, brushing her nose affectionately against mine, What does the Brieux architect want to do today? Because I am officially retiring from the corporate espionage business. I laughed softly, the sound bright and clear in the quiet room. Retiring? What are you going to do with all your free time?
I plan to spend a very large portion of it worshipping you, she answered instantly, her tone completely serious despite the playful gleam in her eye. But beyond that, I want to show you the world, Riley. She shifted slightly, pulling the white duvet up around our shoulders to keep us warm, though her body heat was more than enough. I want to take you to Kyoto to see the ancient temples, Sloane continued, painting a picture of our future with her dark, hypnotic voice. I want to take you to the Amalfi coast. We can rent a villa on the cliffs, drink expensive wine, and spend weeks without looking at a single blueprint or security grid. I listened to her, my heart performing a joyful, chaotic dance. I don't think I want to go back to Seattle, I admitted, the realization blooming suddenly in my chest. I loved Enigma constructs. I loved the puzzles. But I built them because I needed to control my environment. I needed to feel safe. I looked up at Sloane, my hazel eyes completely clear and certain. I don't need the puzzles anymore. I have you. I am already safe. Sloane's icy eyes flared with a fierce, protective pride. You will never need to build a cage again, my love, she promised, sealing the vow with a firm, lingering kiss on my lips. The world is entirely yours to explore, and I will be right beside you for every single step. Kyoto sounds perfect, I whispered against her mouth, my fingers tracing the strong line of her collarbone. And Italy. Anywhere you want, she agreed, her lips trailing down to press a hot, wet kiss against the base of my throat, making me gasp softly. But for right now, Sloane murmured, her voice vibrating against my skin as her hands began to explore my body all over again. I think we are going to stay in bed a little while longer. I think that is a flawless design, I breathed, pulling her impossibly closer, completely lost in the beautiful, endless warmth of her love. 3 months later, the violent storms of Geneva felt like a lifetime away. I was sitting on the sun-drenched terrace of a private, incredibly secluded villa perched high on the cliffs of the Amalfi coast. The Mediterranean Sea stretched out before me, an endless, breathtaking expanse of crushed sapphire glittering under the late afternoon sun. The warm Italian breeze carried the intoxicating scent of lemon groves, salt water, and blooming jasmine. There were no reinforced concrete walls here. There were no hidden security cameras, no biometric scanners, and absolutely no subterranean labyrinths. There was only the open sky, the sound of crashing waves far below, and the absolute, unwavering peace I had finally found. I was holding a piece of high-quality charcoal in my right hand, sketching on a thick, cream-colored linen canvas propped up on an easel. I looked down at my hand. The hydrofluoric acid burn had completely healed, leaving behind a smooth, faint silvery scar that stretched across my knuckles. It didn't hurt anymore. It was just a quiet reminder of the fire we had walked through to get here. I wasn't drafting floor plans. I wasn't calculating load-bearing walls or designing recursive mechanical paradoxes. I was drawing the woman I loved. I heard the soft, familiar sound of bare feet stepping onto the warm terracotta tiles of the terrace. I didn't need to turn around to know she was there. The sharp, clone scent of bergamot washed over me, perfectly mingling with the sea breeze. Sloane walked up behind my wooden stool. She was holding 2 crystal glasses filled with a deep, vintage red wine. She had traded her tailored corporate suits and heavy tactical gear for a loose, unbuttoned white linen shirt that hung beautifully off her shoulders, revealing a simple black silk bralette underneath. Her platinum blonde hair was slightly tousled by the ocean wind, making her look effortlessly, devastatingly gorgeous. She set the 2 crystal glasses down on the small wrought iron table beside my easel.
Without a word, she wrapped her arms around my shoulders from behind. She leaned down, pressing her warm chest against my back, and rested her chin gently on my shoulder. "You have been staring at that canvas for an hour, my beautiful architect," Sloane murmured. Her voice was a low, dark velvet hum that vibrated directly against my skin. Even after 3 months of waking up next to her every single day, the sound of her voice still sent a familiar electric thrill racing straight to my core. She turned her head slightly, pressing a soft, lingering kiss to the sensitive skin just beneath my ear. "I'm not staring," I replied, a profound smile spreading across my lips as I leaned back into her embrace. "I am observing." I tilted my canvas slightly so she could see. It was a detailed, meticulously shaded charcoal portrait of Sloane standing by the edge of the infinity pool earlier that morning. I had captured the sharp, aristocratic lines of her profile, the intense focus in her eyes, and the relaxed, unguarded slope of her shoulders. Sloane looked at the drawing for a long moment in silence. Her arms tightened around me, holding me with that same fierce, possessive devotion that had kept me safe in the darkest depths of the Alps. "You see me entirely too well, Riley," she whispered, her tone thick with an emotion that bordered on absolute reverence. "I see the woman who saved my life," I corrected softly. I set the charcoal pencil down on the tray. I turned around on the wooden stool, completely abandoning the canvas. I looked up at her. The golden hour sunlight caught her icy blue eyes, warming them into a breathtaking shade of crystalline blue. There was no trace of the terrifying, unfeeling ice cream left in her expression. When she looked at me, she was completely open, her soul laid bare. Sloane reached out, gently taking my right hand in hers. She brought my hand to her lips, pressing a remarkably tender kiss directly over the silvery scar on my knuckles. The gesture was so profoundly intimate, so overflowing with love, that it made my breath hitch in my throat. "I didn't just save your life, Riley," she murmured, her thumb slowly stroking my palm. "You saved mine. You gave me a reason to stop looking for the fatal flaw in the world and start looking at the beauty in it." She stepped closer, parting my knees slightly so she could step completely into my space. I reached up, wrapping my arms securely around her narrow waist, pulling her flush against me. The heat radiating from her body was entirely intoxicating. I buried my face against her stomach, breathing in the scent of her skin, the expensive linen, and the Italian sun. Sloane's hands tangled into my messy brunette hair, her fingers massaging my scalp with a slow, deliberate rhythm that made my eyes flutter shut. "No more cages," I whispered into the soft fabric of her shirt, echoing the promise she had made to me in the freezing vault. "No more cages," Sloane agreed fiercely. "Only this. Only us." She gently grasped my chin, tilting my head up so she could look at me again. Her gaze dropped to my lips, her eyes darkening with that familiar, magnetic hunger. She leaned down and captured my mouth in a slow, sweeping kiss. It was a taste of absolute luxury and endless time. Her lips were soft, warm, and tasted faintly of the rich red wine she had been drinking. I opened my mouth for her, letting out a soft sigh as her tongue brushed against mine. I tangled my fingers into the linen of her shirt, pulling her down impossibly closer. The kiss deepened, shifting from a tender exchange of affection into a heavy, languid exploration of pure desire. Every slide of her lips, every gentle, possessive squeeze of her hands on my waist was a reminder that I was entirely hers, and I loved it. I surrendered to her completely, my fierce independence completely and happily melted away by the sheer magnitude of her love. When we finally broke the kiss, the sun was just beginning to dip below the horizon, painting the sky in brilliant strokes of violet, burnt orange, and deep crimson. Sloane rested her forehead against mine, both of us breathing a little heavier, our faces flushed with heat. "The sun is setting," I murmured, my eyes still closed, completely drunk on her proximity. Let it set, Sloane whispered, her lips brushing softly against my jawline, trailing fire across my skin. We have the rest of the night. We have the rest of our lives. She pulled back just enough to look into my eyes, a devastatingly beautiful, arrogant smirk playing on her lips. And I fully intend to spend the next several hours reminding you exactly who you belong to, designer. A thrilling, reckless shiver ran down my spine. I smiled, reaching up to completely unbutton the rest of her white linen shirt. Then I highly suggest you start immediately, consultant. The sun completely surrendered to the horizon, plunging the Amalfi coast into a deep, velvety twilight. Sloane didn't let my feet touch the terracotta tiles again. She swept me up into her arms with that effortless, terrifying strength I had come to completely rely on. I wrapped my arms around her neck, burying my face into the crook of her shoulder as she carried me inside the villa. The cool ocean breeze was instantly replaced by the warm, intimately lit atmosphere of our master bedroom. She laid me down gently in the center of the massive, king-sized bed. The stark white sheets were cool against my flushed skin. Sloane stood by the edge of the bed for a long moment, simply looking at me.
The moonlight spilled through the open French doors, illuminating her flawless, athletic silhouette. Her white linen shirt hung completely open, sliding slowly off her shoulders before pooling silently onto the hardwood floor. She was looking at me not as a puzzle to be solved, but as a masterpiece she had sworn to protect. She climbed onto the bed, crawling over the sheets with the slow, predatory grace of a magnificent feline. She caged me in, a hand resting on either side of my head, completely trapping me in the safest place on earth. "You are so incredibly beautiful," Sloane whispered, her voice dropping to a dark, raspy hum that instantly made my heart hammer against my ribs. "Come here," I breathed, my hands reaching up to tangle in her platinum hair. I pulled her down, our lips met in a fiery, consuming collision that completely shattered whatever fragile restraint we had left. It was a kiss that tasted of rich red wine, salt air, and absolute, unconditional devotion. Her mouth was hot and demanding, parting my lips and claiming every inch of my senses. I arched into her, my fingers tracing the strong muscles of her back, pulling her heavy, warm body flush against mine. There was no rush. We had outrun the ticking clocks. We had broken the paradoxes. We had all of eternity. Sloane broke the kiss slowly, tracing a path of wet, birding kisses down my jawline. She lingered at the sensitive pulse point on my neck, her teeth grazing the skin just enough to elicit a soft, breathless gasp from my throat. "Mine," she murmured against my skin, her voice thick with a dark, heavy possessiveness. "Always," I promised, my hands gripping her shoulders, completely lost in the intoxicating haze of her touch. Her hands were everywhere, tracing the curves of my body with agonizingly slow, deliberate worship. She mapped every scar, every contour, treating my skin as if it were the most precious, fragile artifact in the world. She kissed the faint, savory scar on my right hand. She kissed my collarbone. She kissed the center of my chest, directly over my racing heart. When we finally made love, it was a profound, earth-shattering collision of two souls that had survived the dark to finally find the light. I surrendered every ounce of my control to her. I let her unravel me completely. In the quiet darkness of the Italian night, surrounded by the sound of crashing waves, Sloane loved me with a fierce, terrifying intensity that completely rewrote my understanding of the universe. And I loved her back, giving her every single broken piece of my heart, knowing she would hold them forever. I woke up the next morning to the sound of seagulls and the gentle, rhythmic stroke of Sloane's fingers running through my hair. My head was resting on her bare chest. The steady, strong beat of her heart was the most comforting sound I had ever known. I opened my eyes, blinking against the bright, cheerful Mediterranean sunlight flooding the room.
"Good morning, my love," Sloane whispered, pressing a soft kiss to the top of my head. "Good morning," I smiled, shifting my weight and tilting my chin up to look at her. She looked entirely relaxed. The harsh lines of her past life as a ruthless corporate operative were completely washed away. She was just Sloane, my Sloane. She shifted slightly, reaching over to the wooden nightstand beside the bed. When she turned back to me, she was holding a small, deep blue velvet box. My breath caught in my throat. My heart suddenly forgot how to beat. Sloane sat up, pulling the white duvet around her waist. She looked down at me, her icy blue eyes shining with a vulnerability and a depth of emotion that completely paralyzed me. "You spent your entire life building flawless, impossible locks, Riley," Sloane said, her voice dropping to a quiet, incredibly serious whisper. She opened the velvet box. Inside rested a simple, stunningly elegant platinum band. It had no complex mechanisms, it had no hidden gears or secret compartments. It was a pure, uninterrupted circle of brilliant metal. "I don't want to build a lock for you," she continued, her thumb gently brushing a tear that had just escaped my eye. "I don't want to trap you. I don't want to be a cage." She reached out and took my left hand, holding it tenderly in hers. "I want to be your home, Riley. I want to be the place you choose to walk into every single day for the rest of our lives." She looked directly into my tear-filled hazel eyes. "There is no puzzle here, my beautiful architect. There is no trick, just a simple question." She took a slow, deep breath. "Will you marry me?" A sob of pure, unadulterated joy broke from my lips. I couldn't even form the word. I just nodded frantically, throwing my arms around her neck and pulling her into a desperate, crushing embrace. "Yes," I finally managed to cry against her shoulder, my tears wetting her skin. "Yes, Sloane, 1,000 times, yes." Sloane let out a shaky, beautiful laugh. It was a sound of absolute, victorious relief. She pulled back just enough to slip the cool platinum band onto my ring finger. It fit perfectly, flawlessly. She brought my hand to her lips, kissing the ring, and then kissing me. It was a kiss that sealed our past, present, and future. It was the ultimate, unbreakable promise. Later that morning, we stood together on the sun-drenched terrace, drinking freshly brewed coffee. The world below us was vibrant, loud, and brilliantly alive. Sloane stood behind me, her arms wrapped tightly around my waist, her chin resting on my shoulder. I leaned back against her, my left hand resting over hers, the platinum ring catching the bright Italian sun. We looked out at the endless, glittering expanse of the Mediterranean Sea. There were no more death traps. There were no more paradoxes to solve. The game was finally over, and we had won everything. We stopped building cages and finally found our freedom. The game is over, and we won everything. Thank you for surviving this incredible journey with us. Before you go, drop a comment below. Where in the world are you listening from today?